Envision a country facing significant challenges, where determination meets oppression and the desire for freedom unites its people. This is Georgia's ongoing effort to resist Russian influence, a journey marked by resilience that extends beyond its borders. If you think that Ukraine's fight against Russia is a fight of David and Goliath, which it is, Georgia is 10 times smaller than Ukraine in terms of landmass and population. Georgia is only 69.7 thousand square kilometers with 3.7 million citizens. So yeah, the fight of David and Goliath on steroids. However, Georgia's story is not only interesting because of its struggle against Russia. I mean, this is Russia's bread and butter to oppress its neighbors, but because the world has turned a blind eye to the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, which arguably led Russia to embolden its ambitions and attack Ukraine in 2014 and in 2022. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but Georgia endures. The roots of this saying remain unknown, yet it is often echoed throughout Georgia. It embodies a sense of national pride in the belief that the country has maintained a continuous tradition of statehood, which continues from ancient times despite periods of interruption. Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991 and was recognized as a member of the United Nations in 1992. The collective pride of Georgians in their statehood has influenced the way history is remembered since 1989. The late 1980s marked a significant turning point in the history of Georgia. The implementation of perestroika and glasnost by the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev resulted in a loosening of political control. This era witnessed a revival of Georgian national awareness and renewed demand for independence. The movement was characterized by mass protests and establishment of nationalist political organizations. And here is how we can describe Gorbachev's USSR. During the peak of Gorbachev's perestroika, a consumer walks into a grocery store and asks, "Can you please weigh out a half a kilogram of meat?" The clerk answers, "Of course, bring it in and I'll weigh it." Fun times. One of the most crucial incidents during this time was the massacre in Tbilisi on April 9th, 1989. Peaceful protesters calling for independence were violently assaulted by the Soviet army. This heartbreaking event intensified the independence movement and fueled a rise in nationalistic feelings. The early 1990s were critical for Georgia's pursuit of independence. As the Soviet Union was disintegrating, Georgia held its first multi-party elections in 1990. On April 9, 1991, exactly 2 years after the Tbilisi massacre, the Georgian Supreme Council proclaimed the restoration of the Georgian state's independence. This declaration marked a pivotal moment, symbolizing the conclusions of Soviet dominance and the start of a new era. The subsequent years proved to be challenging for the newly independent Georgia. The nation grappled with substantial political, economic, and social turmoil, including internal conflicts and efforts to create a stable democratic system. Despite these difficulties, Georgia's dedication to forming a sovereign and democratic state remained steadfast. Georgia's push for EU and NATO membership, despite Russian interference, is like trying to board a train while a Russian guy keeps stealing your ticket. Eventually, you'll just jump on anyway. Following independence, Georgia encountered enormous obstacles in building a stable and recognized nation. The early 1990s were characterized by political turmoil, economic struggles, and internal conflicts. Separatist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, backed by Russia, posed significant threats to the country's territorial integrity. These conflicts resulted in considerable human suffering and displacement. Today, 1 in every 13 Georgians is internally displaced. There are currently almost 300,000 internally displaced persons in Georgia, constituting 8% of the entire population. Obviously, Georgians want to go back, but Russia's policy on Georgian refugees is like its policy on occupied land. Act like they don't exist and never give them back. On the international front, other countries slowly acknowledge Georgia's independence. This recognition was vital for the country's integration into the global community. However, the ongoing internal discord and economic issues overshadowed these diplomatic achievements, underscoring the challenges faced in transitioning from a Soviet republic to an independent state. So, despite the Russian occupation, civil wars, and various political, economic challenges, many Georgians have expressed pride in their nation's journey since gaining independence and consider it a functioning democracy. Let's talk about the 2008 war. On August 8, 2008, Russian troops launched an invasion of Georgia, initiating the first war in Europe in the 21st century. Although the conflict was resolved in just a few days, the impacts of the Russo-Georgian War continue to be felt today. Remember when Putin first denied the annexation of Crimea in 2014? In 2008, Putin was proud that his plan worked well. The global response to Russia's military actions in Georgia turned out to be surprisingly subdued, with Moscow facing minimal repercussions. Instead, EU leaders called for a ceasefire that seemed to align with Russian objectives, while the Obama administration in the US quickly sought a reset in relations with Russia. And why did Obama's reset button with Russia fail? Because it was mistranslated. It's a joke, but it's literally true. Naturally, this conciliatory stance was interpreted by many in Moscow as an implicit invitation for additional aggressive actions. 6 years after the Russo-Georgian War, Russia initiated a much more extensive military operation in Ukraine. Due to the August 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, Georgia suffered the loss of 170 personnel from the Ministry of Defense, 14 from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and 228 civilians. The total number of wounded and injured among civilians and military personnel reached 2,232. Additionally, ethnic cleansing was carried out by Russia and its proxies in the Chkinvali region. This forced over 30,000 people to flee their homes. Most of their houses were deliberately burned down to prevent their return. Tbilisi's pro-Western foreign policy and aspirations to join the European structures are viewed by the Kremlin as a significant security threat. The rise of a democratic system in Georgia contrasts sharply with Russia's authoritarian regime, potentially inspiring other nations. Putin considers Georgia part of Russia's sphere of influence, and NATO's enlargement is perceived as a hostile act against Russia's dominance in the region. Consequently, the democratization of Georgia and its growing ties with NATO have led to Kremlin dissatisfaction, culminating in the 2008 August War. This conflict was preceded by the 2008 NATO Bucharest Summit, which promised future membership to Georgia. However, a lack of consensus left it without a membership action plan or security guarantees. This is a recipe for the wars in Europe. The West gives promises to integrate post-Soviet countries into NATO or the EU without security guarantees. And the cherry on top, Russia wages war. So what happened in 2008? In August 2008, tensions between Russia and Georgia escalated into war. It started on August the 1st, when South Ossetian forces, backed by Russia, began shelling Georgian villages. Just 3 months before, Georgia was promised a future NATO membership. Despite Georgia declaring a ceasefire to avoid war, the attacks continued, leading Georgian forces to respond on August the 7th. Russia quickly intervened, seizing disputed territories and expanding the conflict into Abkhazia, another breakaway region of Georgia. Fighting only stopped on August the 13th, where French President Nicolas Sarkozy brokered a ceasefire. To justify its military action, Russia accused Georgia of committing genocide and aggression against Ossetians. Dear viewers, believe it or not, Russia lied. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for 3 men accusing of war crimes during Russia's 2008 war with Georgia. The suspects are Lieutenant General Mikhail Minzayev, Gamlet Kuchmazov, and David Sanakuyev. They held key positions in the Russian-backed South Ossetian government. The ICC began investigating the 5-day war in 2016, which displaced thousands and saw severe human rights abuses. Judges found reasonable grounds to believe that the suspects were responsible for crimes such as unlawful confinement, torture, and hostage-taking between August 8th to August 27th, 2008. Around 170 detainees, including women and elderly people, were held in harsh conditions and later used as bargaining chips in prisoner exchanges. After the war, Russia officially recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. and continued occupying them, violating the ceasefire agreement. Today, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are so independent that they need Russia's permission to say it out loud. But if you think that today's Russian Federation is a creepy state, how about Russia's creeping occupation of Georgia? This is not a word play or a pun. It's actually what's happening. The border is literally creeping closer and closer, taking more land from the Georgians. Since Russia's 2008 invasion, it has occupied 20% of Georgia's land, gradually expanding its control through tactics like borderization and creeping occupation. This means Russia builds barriers and increases surveillance, and slowly pushes its control further without direct military action. These efforts not only strengthened Russia's grip, but also made it harder for Georgia to join Western institutions and disrupt important economic routes. Local communities suffer greatly. Movement is restricted, livelihoods are affected, and many experience psychological distress. Beyond territorial control, Russia uses these tactics as a form of hybrid warfare, aiming to weaken Georgia's sovereignty and block its path toward Western integration. You know, Russia telling Georgia to stay out of the EU and NATO is like a burglar telling the homeowner not to install a lock. Speaking of Georgia's Western integration, for Georgians, being part of Europe is extremely important. Late Georgian Prime Minister Zurab Shvania, in front of the Council of Europe in 1999, said the following words: "I am Georgian, therefore I'm European." During the speech, he expressed Georgia's EU aspirations and outlined the country's foreign policy agenda for the next decade. Indeed, since the Rose Revolution in 2003, Georgia has significantly deepened its ties to the EU. But as you might have guessed correctly, not everything went as planned. Georgian Dream, or Ostneva, as it is widely called, did everything to halt Georgia's EU integration. But at first, it seemed that the Georgian Dream followed the European path. In June 2014, the EU and Georgia signed an association agreement which entered into force in July 1st, 2016. From March 28th, 2017, Georgian nationals with biometric passports can travel visa-free to the 26 countries of the Schengen area. However, we must admit that the Georgian Dream European aspirations were a little bit suspicious. Why? Because the leader of the party and the de facto ruler of the country, Bidzina Ivanishvili, is a businessman who earned his first billion in Russia. And you know why the Russian oligarch brought a ventriloquist dummy to the interview? To prove that he could totally speak without Putin's hand up his ass. Nevertheless, the EU granted Georgia a candidate status in December 2023. But after the parliamentary elections in 2024, political tensions have escalated. On October 30th, the European Commission stated that Georgia's efforts to join the EU have mostly stopped due to the actions of its government since spring 2024. They urged Georgia to overturn new laws that weaken the rule of law and basic rights, as well as stopping the spread of misleading information about the EU values. The first wave of protests was caused by the results of the election, because many people in Georgia thought that the Georgian Dream falsified them. Electoral experts and data analysts have detected voting anomalies suggesting possible fraud. These irregularities, dubbed the Russian tail, resemble patterns seen in Russia's 2020 constitutional referendum. Despite reports of violations, the ruling Georgian Dream Party and the Central Election Commission deny any wrongdoing, while the opposition and president reject the results. Analysts, including Roman Udot, Levan Kvirkelia, examined voting data using statistical methods like the Shpilkin and Sobyanin-Shukovolsky models, which helped identify manipulations. Their analysis shows that while urban voting patterns mostly follow expected distributions, rural areas exhibit suspicious deviations. Specifically, high voter turnout in certain districts disproportionately benefited the Georgian Dream, forming an unusual tail in vote distribution graphs, an indicator of a potential falsification. Udot describes these anomalies as unhealthy, comparing them to manipulated elections in Russia. While alternative explanations exist, experts argue that the statistical patterns strongly suggest electoral manipulation, raising concerns over Georgia's democratic process. Generally, Russian-style elections are like magic shows. Ballots disappear, results appear, and the winner is chosen before the trick even starts. According to the OSCE ODIHR, candidates could generally campaign freely. Election day saw issues like ballot secrecy breaches, procedural inconsistencies, and intimidation through vote recording. Reports of pressure, particularly in public employees and vulnerable citizens, further undermined the trust. Opposition parties rejected the results, citing voter intimidation, vote buying, and foreign interference. Over 1,200 complaints were filed, but most were dismissed with minimal investigation. Courts upheld the majority of these decisions, failing to address the integrity concerns. The Central Election Commission in the post-Soviet country insisting the election was fair is like an old KGB officer claiming they've always been big on democracy. Nobody believes it, but they say it with a straight face. And as if this was not enough, on November 28th, Irakli Kobakidze, who assumed the role of the Prime Minister, announced that he was suspending his country's EU membership application process until the end of 2028. His announcement came after the European Parliament condemned Georgia's 26th October parliamentary elections, stating they were neither free nor fair. This fired up the next protests wave. Amnesty International has exposed severe human rights abuses in Georgia. Police have violently suppressed anti-government protests since November 29th. Protesters have faced arbitrary arrests, torture, and ill treatment, with journalists also targeted. Over 460 people have been detained, with 300 reporting severe beatings. Kobakidze announcing Georgia's stopping its EU application is like a kid quitting a race he was never fast enough to win. Except in this case, his coach, presumably Russia, told him to trip on purpose. Authorities have used unlawful force, including tear gas, rubber bullets, and chemically laced water cannons, leading to over 100 severe injuries. Amnesty verified systematic abuses, including coerced confessions and denial of medical care. Detained protesters described being beaten in darkened police vans and pressured into signing pre-written confessions under threat. Masked individuals have assaulted both protesters and journalists with police complicity. Courts have rejected claims of abuse, favoring police accounts over video footage and witness testimonies, thereby reinforcing a culture of state-sanctioned impunity. A television journalist and a cameraman faced violence from masked attackers while they were reporting on pro-EU demonstrations in Georgia. Reporter Maka Chikladze from the pro-opposition network TV Pirveli was aggressively slammed to the ground while the cameraman Georgi Shetiruli was kicked in the head on a side street. They were covering the 10th consecutive night of widespread pro-EU protests. Lukashenko and Putin might be happy as such violence is part of the best tradition of their regimes, because Putin and Lukashenko treat protests like bad news. They just suppress it. The Georgian Dream has increasingly used the criminal justice system to suppress protests and dissent. Recent amendments to the law on assemblies and demonstrations severely limit freedom of assembly and expression, introducing high fines and extending administrative detention to 60 days, and decriminalizing public calls for violence and resistance to police. Harsh penalties for unauthorized protests, including fines for wearing masks or using lasers, grant law enforcement broad powers to detain demonstrators. Organizers face increased liability, spontaneous demonstrations are limited, and prior permission is required. Basically, the government says you're free to protest, just as long as you do it silently, alone, and in your own head. Moreover, changes have been proposed to Georgia's criminal code to expand the definition of treason. The following actions would be considered as treason: violating the country's territorial integrity, making unconstitutional agreements or negotiations, threatening Georgia's external security, working for foreign intelligence services, harming Georgia's defense capabilities, revealing state secrets. All good, but the timing of the proposed law is suspicious. We all can guess how they will use it now. So what's next? Despite the recent brutal crackdowns on protesters, people still gather every evening in many cities across the country. Georgians continue to refuse to become Russia's space of influence. Since its independence, the country has shown numerous times that it wants to be free. Georgians continue to pay the ultimate price for its future. So far, neither Russia, by the hands of the ruling party, has not backed down from their plans to subjugate Georgia. However, only time can show whether they will achieve their goal or fail as the Soviets did. My friends, thank you for watching this analysis and thank you for trusting your time with me. This is a members only special video for every Saturday. That means 4 extra videos per month. Each Saturday you will get one. To become a member and get an early access to these 4 special videos, just join the channel. It's only 99 cents and the link is in the description below. Until my next video, which will be on Monday, or until my next special members only video, which will be on next Saturday, stay cool, Slava Ukraini, and bye-bye.